Hello, this lecture is on the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment represents a period from approximately the late 1600s to the late 1700s. This era has also been referred to as the Age of Reason. The vision of material, social, and political advancement inspired Enlightenment leaders who became known as philosophers. Only a few were actual philosophers. Even the larger category of philosophers consisted of a tiny minority of men and women who submitted all important questions to the test of reason. Using the expanding printing press culture, Enlightenment writers shared their application of the new science to the human condition. German philosopher Immanuel Kant wrote of bringing, quote, light into the dark corners of the mind. Enlightenment intellectuals believed that by using the scientific method, one could discover the laws of society. It was the birth of social science. Enlightenment thinkers had their own biases and shortcomings. They were confident they knew better. Most held smug and self-righteous attitudes. They distrusted the uneducated people. Some, such as French thinker Voltaire, openly despised the common masses. They gave little credit to intellectual achievements and innovations of an earlier age. For them, the pre-17th century period was a time of darkness. Recent scholarship has challenged the idea of a dark age. Scholars argue that during the so-called dark ages, Europe surpassed the technology and science of all regions of the world. One study argues that the idea that Europe fell into the dark ages is a hoax promoted by 18th century intellectuals who were hostile to Christianity. Put another way, one objective of Enlightenment intellectuals was to promote the cultural superiority of their own era. A closer look at the medieval age reveals significant accomplishments. There were intellectual and material progress combined with Christian doctrines of moral equality, and there was this emergence of a new world based on political, economic, and personal freedom. Developments by medieval Europeans included an improved market and trade system. For example, there was a commercial revolution aided by monks who replaced their subsistence economies and became highly productive, specialized participants in rapidly expanding trading networks. There was the emergence of banks and better banking. Double entry bookkeeping of credit and debt was an important development during the medieval age. Agricultural developments during the medieval period included a rigid, well-padded horse collar that put the weight from the horse's neck to shoulders. This allowed horses to double the plowing of an oxen. The three-field system of 3 plots, winter crop, spring crop, and fallow period was superior to the 2-field system of the Romans. For the making of clothes, there were treadle powdered looms, which were foot-powered, and water-powered fulling machines that eliminated impurities in woolen cloth making. For habitation, there were the innovations of chimneys and fireplaces. Other notable examples were the inventions of eyeglasses, horse stirrups, complex sails for sailing, and better improved musical instruments such as the violin and pipe organ. A survey of all medieval developments reveals a much different picture than the one portrayed by Enlightenment leaders. According to one scholar, all of these remarkable developments can be traced to the unique Christian conviction that progress was a God-given obligation entailed in the gift of reason. So many philosophers were unwilling to give credit where it was due. And certainly the earlier centuries, the medieval period, was no dark age. Enlightenment intellectuals were also mistaken in their analysis of Christianity and science. They claimed there was an inherent conflict between religion and science. Certainly, there were cases of conflict, but in the bigger picture, closer to the truth is the shared common ground of science and faith. Science and religion were compatible and inseparable. The rise of science was achieved by deeply religious Christian scholars. Pointing out the shortcomings of 18th century elites is not to diminish the importance of the Enlightenment. The confidence of Enlightenment leaders was a direct result of genuine scientific advances made during the 17th century. Isaac Newton's work especially had demonstrated that modern thought was superior to the best science of ancient times. Reason was championed since it was reason that deciphered and explained nature. If reason could explain nature, why not use reason to explain political and social problems? The vision of reason as supreme led to calls for reform. One major thinker of the Enlightenment was French thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau was among those who believed that men could fix the problems of society with their unaided intellects. This confidence to cure societal problems was a first in human history. Rousseau's influence was enormous in the short and long term. Although he died before the French Revolution, well-known commentators of the day, such as British conservative Edmund Burke, held Rousseau responsible for the French Revolution. In the long term, Rousseau influenced modern ideas of education and critiques of capitalism. Rousseau saw competition as evil. He linked private property and social crime. Because culture dictated man's behavior, Rousseau said, the key to improving man's behavior was to change culture and the competitive forces which produced it. In other words, Rousseau was looking at social engineering as the answer. Were born in Geneva in an upper-class family, Rousseau had a lifelong contempt for the voteless mob. He was against commerce, thus against capitalism, even though a healthy economy raised material standards across all classes. He had no sisters, and his only brother ran away, never to be seen again. Rousseau had impressive writing ability, but he was 39 years old before he made his mark with his essay Discourse. And this was published in 1750. The Social Contract and Emile were two of his works published in 1762. Rousseau's writing on truth and virtue was influential, and he became a favorite at fashionable houses. So he would be one who would visit the various meetings held by philosophers at private residencies. This is even more interesting, given that his character was questionable. He was vain, egotistical, and quarrelsome. Historian Paul Johnson writes that Rousseau was the first intellectual systematically to exploit the guilt of the privileged. And he did it, moreover, in an entirely new way, by his systematic cult of rudeness. He was the prototype of that characteristic figure of the modern age, the angry young man. Even those who cared little for his ideas found his character fascinating. Rousseau possessed spontaneity, but in fact, he was a calculating man. He used his psychological skills to persuade and get the best of people. He saw himself as the highest of moral human beings. He spoke highly of truth, but he himself was a scheming liar. When he wrote of his quarrels with others, he fabricated evidence and rewrote history with superb ingenuity. Published after his death, his book, The Confessions, advanced his name in intellectual circles far and wide. But Confessions was full of half-truths. Unless supported by external evidence, no statement in the Confessions can be trusted. Rousseau exalted virtue in his writing, but his behavior presented another side. He showed no affection to his family, and he treated many others terribly. He failed to help those who had helped him in his earlier years. Rousseau fathered 5 children, but he abandoned every one of them. Because of his contradictory writing, some of Rousseau's political ideas range widely, but essential to him was the state. With social engineering, it could inculcate virtue in all. Paul Johnson explains Rousseau's idea of the state this way. The state was the father, the patrie, and all its citizens were the children of the paternal orphanage. Though Rousseau writes about the general will in terms of liberty, it is essentially an authoritarian instrument. Rousseau's state is also totalitarian, since it orders every aspect of human activity, thought included. Under the social contract, the individual was obliged to alienate himself with all his rights to the whole of the community. Community, of course, meaning the state. Rousseau wrote that those who control a people's opinion control its actions. Johnson explains that such control is established by teaching citizens from infancy as children of the state, trained to consider themselves only in their relationship to the body of the state. On people and the state, Rousseau declared, "For being nothing except by it, they will be nothing except for it. It will have all they have and will be all they are." Rousseau concluded that some people have to be forced to be free. He insisted that the government took control of the upbringing of all children. The role he gave the state wasn't an influential idea. The legislator could solve all human problems. For Rousseau and other Enlightenment intellectuals, politics could do it all. Although Enlightenment thinking had a large impact on the culture of the upper classes, many Enlightenment ideas were foreign to the uneducated masses. The main reasons for this were high illiteracy and the lack of a medium for cultural producers like the philosophers. The elite could not shape and control people's thinking. Even if they could have controlled the media of the day, most people could not read. The Enlightenment did not have a large, immediate impact on society, consequently. Many Enlightenment thinkers lived in a bubble. Most could not appreciate the persisting strength of Christianity, for example. This was a significant weakness on their part. The common masses could not embrace Enlightenment ideas that challenged much of Christian theology. Most ordinary folk embraced a Christian understanding of the meaning of life. This disconnect between the philosophers and the common masses foreshadowed future relations between elites and Bible-believing Christians. With a few exceptions, Enlightenment thinkers believed in a God, yet their God was a distant and deistic God. For them, the mechanistic strain in 17th century science pointed instead to a more impersonal deity ruling through the invariable natural laws. In the 18th century, the spread of science tempted the philosophers with a new image of God, an abstract supreme being who dealt with his cosmos and his creatures through impersonal secondary causes. God was viewed as a great clockmaker who built an orderly universe and then stepped aside and let it run. Philosophers saw a cosmology of immutable mathematical laws and a history devoid of divine activity. And another word for immutable would be like absolute. So absolute mathematical laws. The philosophers viewed Christianity's preoccupation with salvation and its belief in the depravity of human nature, a consequence of Adam and Eve's defiance of God, as barriers to social improvement and earthly happiness. So as far as the philosophers were concerned, it would have been far better off if citizens just pushed aside their biblical beliefs. For the philosophers, the notion of original sin, the idea of humans being depraved, was a barrier to happiness. The philosophers repudiated the idea of original sin, clerical authority, revelation, and miracles. In the writings of scientists and social theorists of the Enlightenment era, God had not completely disappeared, but they were critical of the churches, religious disputes, and the certainty of Christians guided by the Bible. The Enlightenment spawned much religious doubt and some atheistic speculation. But even in its radical variants, 18th century culture did not support unbelief as a really viable option. The natural religion favored by the more adventurous Enlightenment thinkers constituted a thin-blooded form of theism. Unbelief required too great a divorce from reality as understood during the Enlightenment to be either palatable or plausible. Not all educated Europeans embraced the secular arguments and themes of the Enlightenment. Christian thinkers who were impressed with the scholarship of forerunners of the Enlightenment, such as Isaac Newton and John Locke, still insisted that religious belief involved something more than rationalism. Evangelicalism was in part a reaction against rationalism. Modern evangelicalism came into existence during the Enlightenment. Scholars have identified four key components of evangelicalism: an emphasis on the new birth as life-changing experience, a reliance on the Bible as ultimate religious authority, a concern for spreading the faith, the gospel, and a focus on Christ's redeeming work on the cross. There were many impressive Christian scholar preachers who stood strong in the Enlightenment era. John Wesley studied at Oxford University, where he distinguished himself as a scholar of languages. While at Oxford, he became a leader of a holy club, a club that attracted students seeking an inward holiness. The group followed certain methods in their religious life. Members of the club rose 4 a.m. for private prayer and devotion, and on weekdays, they studied the classics and Greek New Testament readings. It was because they ruled their lives by method that they were nicknamed Methodists. Wesley was ordained an Anglican priest and became known for his enthusiastic preaching. He played an important role in revival activity in Britain and the rise of Methodism. Enlightenment thinking missed the mark with most people, but there were positive aspects of the Enlightenment that received the support of many. There were important gains in political and economic thought that benefited all citizens. The work of English philosopher John Locke and French philosopher Montesquieu, for example, advanced modern political thought. Locke maintained that the right to govern derived from the consent of the governed and was a form of contract. When people gave their consent to a government, they expected it to govern justly, protect their property, and ensure liberties for the propertied. If a government did not govern justly, it violated the natural rights of the individual. Thus, it reneged, excuse me. Excuse me. Thus, it reneged on its contract and forfeited the loyalty of its subjects. It was important that citizens obey the laws of the land, but there could be laws that many recognize as unjust. Laws could not only benefit the governing class and its supporters, good laws were for the whole community. French philosopher Montesquieu wrote, quote, "There is no greater tyranny than which is perpetrated under the shield of the law and in the name of justice." Montesquieu was critical of royal absolutism, and he advanced ideas on a balanced system of government where citizens had a greater voice in government. Some, like Englishman Thomas Paine, who played a role in America's War of Independence, questioned the lineage of royalty. Quote, "It is more probable that we could take off the dark covering of antiquity and trace them to the first rise. We should find the first of them nothing better than a ruffian of some restless gang whose savage manners obtained him the title of chief among plunderers, and who by increasing in power and extending his depredations overawed the quiet and defenseless to purchase their safety by frequent contributions." End of quote. Equally impressive to this these advancements with political theory was the advancement in economic thought. The Enlightenment's emphasis on property as the foundation for individual rights and its search for uniform laws inspired by Newton's scientific advancement led to the development of the science of economics. Economics is the study of the use of scarce resources which have alternative uses. So we're talking about an economy, there's always going to be trade-offs. And what's key is the concept of scarcity. Scarcity, there's never enough for what everyone wants. So you have to economize. Economics covered the consequence of decisions that are made about the use of land, labor, capital, and other resources that go into producing the volume of output which determines a country's standard of living. As economist Thomas Sowell points out, those decisions and their consequences can be more important than the resources themselves. Nations with limited raw materials can still thrive with good policies. Nations with abundant natural resources can be poor because of bad economic policies. In the later stage of the Enlightenment, Britain benefited from both good resources and good policies, and the resulting Industrial Revolution rose people's standard of living significantly. The Enlightenment was favorable to the entrepreneur. Scottish philosopher Adam Smith, in his Wealth of Nations, promoted capitalist activity as uniformly worthwhile and never to be inhibited by outside regulation. For centuries, governments promoted the economic theory of mercantilism. Mercantilists believed that a constant shortage of riches existed and that government must direct economic activity in their land as to compete successfully with other nations for a share of the world's limited resources. And the analogy that's helpful is a pie. And with the mercantilists, they believe the world's wealth is finite. It doesn't expand, it doesn't grow, it doesn't change. And the best a nation can do is grab a biggest piece of the pie of this wealth as possible. So the mercantilists had a zero-sum understanding of the economic world, which said that when one person, or you could say one nation, wins, the other person or nation loses. Smith wrote, it was misguided to think this way. And also he faulted the mercantilists for promoting government regulation that typically did not favor most citizens. Smith favored leaving the market to its own devices with minimal regulation by government. Okay, so to just for government to not have any obstacles or barriers for innovation, for entrepreneurship, for ingenuity. Let humans flourish. Don't present obstacles for this creativity. As stated in one West civilization text, quote, Smith was not bothered by the apparent randomness of market forces. Beneath the superficial chaos of commerce, he saw order, the same order that he saw in physical nature through his understanding of the new science. He used the metaphor of the invisible hand to explain the source of this order. That hand would invisibly reconcile self-interest to the common or public interest, end of quote. In other words, quote, freeing individuals to pursue their own rational, selfish interests would in fact further the material well-being of the entire community, both at the local and national levels. Adam Smith was an Enlightenment figure whose ideas did much good. He changed forever the age-old assumptions that wealth is a limited pie over which governments and men fight to get the biggest piece. Wealth can grow without limits was a revolutionary idea. And if we look back further back in history, typically when you have a nation or empire gaining wealth, it was as a result of stealing, of exploiting, not creating itself. In conclusion, the philosophy of the Enlightenment included only a few actual philosophers. The philosophers believed that if only mortals had enough data, they could predict everything that happened, and the tool whereby they could do this in a clock-like universe was reason. Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke, Montesquieu, and Adam Smith advanced important political and economic ideas. However, the typical philosopher fell short in significant ways. They were elitists, and for the most part, they were anti-Christian. The philosophers had little sympathy or respect for the common masses. Many of them were too idealistic, believing that the problems of society could be solved by the acceptance of their rational ideas. Thank you.